Well, we will be welcoming everyone in just a minute. We'll try to make sure that we have a chance for all the participants to join. So we'll start in just a minute. Looks like we are lots of people are joining, so I'll make sure they all get in. Okay, well, it looks like we have a few more people joining. I'll hang on another minute, and then we'll get started. I'll just get it here. So, get this set. All right. Well, thank you. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I know there'll be a few more people joining us, but I think most everyone's had a chance to join the session. So welcome to the Social Worker Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. And we are very excited to welcome new participants, as well as those of you who were able to attend our conference in the past. We hope you got to be part of our opening plenary session with Rashawn Miller, but if you missed that, or if you wish you could see another breakout panel that's also happening right now, that's no problem, because the presentations are being recorded and will be available on our conference website as soon as we have finished the conferences. I'm Jenny Browngan, and I'm happy that you're here for our breakout session that's called How to Maintain Hope in a Racialized Society as a School Social Worker. On behalf of the Planning Committee for the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference, I ask that you join me in the acknowledgement that our University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, here on the shores of Ikla, or Lake Mendota, resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place that they call Dijope, or Four Lake. As the reach of the university extends to the far corners of our state, we also respectfully recognize the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. Whether you're watching this from the land of these 12 First Nations, or you are more distant, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land that you are on. As social workers, we have a duty to critically look at the role of our profession and what we've done and played in the attempted cultural genocide and destruction of Indigenous families, such as was the aim of boarding schools in this state and across our continent. This conference is rooted in critical reflection of our work as social workers. Our goal is to bring clarity about the past, but also to challenge and inspire us to all move our action into our work in our communities once this conference is over. We hope this conference provides space for critical reflection, humility, and openness, which will allow us all to reflect, to hear and tell truths, and move toward action and transformation to support Indigenous rights, cultural equity, and racial equity. With acknowledgement and gratitude, we move forward today in our journey. Just a few details before we get started, letting everyone know, reminding you that our presentation is being recorded and will be available at our conference website at a later date. We know that many of you are also curious about the CEUs you registered for. You are all set. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email, either because you are logged into Zoom or because you provided these upon entering. This allows us to verify attendance. You will get CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed via email in the coming weeks. Your cameras and your microphones will remain muted. We do have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions for our presenters. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we will not be able to get to all questions submitted. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists, Ronnie Rivera, Jackie Thao, Damaris Drohin de Arrieta, and Jerome Flowers. In this year's conference, hope will be placed as a radical discipline at the core of social work and social justice practice. This session will offer ideas and support for school social workers as they move into anti-racist action, with meaningful, tangible practices rooted in the assets and strengths of BIPOC communities. Through this, we will take on the challenge of changing ourselves, our schools, and this society. Today, each of our four panelists will begin by sharing their perspectives on working as a school social worker in these racialized times, the ways that it impacts our students, and how each of the speakers grow and maintain hope. Then we will have some time for questions. Our first speaker today is Ronnie Rivera. Ronnie is a school social worker turned LGBTQ plus coordinator and has 5 years as a school social worker. Currently works as a resident care worker part-time at the Courage House in Milwaukee and is a volunteer as an HIV counselor for BESTD. Panelist Ronnie Rivera, MSW, will talk about hope in a racialized society with an LGBTQ plus lens. When we talk about hope and race, who are we including in that discourse? Ronnie?
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Give me one quick second. And hopefully everyone can see. Can y'all see my screen? All right, I see. All right. All right, thank you. Yes, thank you for that, Jenny. So again, I'm Ronnie Rivera, and we're talking about hope in a racialized society today. I wanted to start and thank UW-Madison, the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work, and all the folks who made this conference happen and who gave me this opportunity to speak. Additionally, I'd like to shout out my fellow colleagues on this panel, and you all are the participants here. We are all in this shared space as learners, and as much as I hope that you all receive from me, I hope to receive from you and learn some things from you all. So we're going to get started. I wanted to talk about hope in a racialized society today, but grounding us in a few definitions with some words. I like to start with hope. So hope is the feeling that what is wanted can be had. Hope is a person or thing in which expectations are centered. Hope is to believe, desire, or trust. Hope is to place trust and rely. Racialize. Racialize is to give a racial character to characterize, marginalize, or regard according to race. Society. Society is an organized group of persons associated together for religious, benevolent, cultural, scientific, political, patriotic, or other purposes. Society is a body of individuals living as members of a community. Society is community. And so I share these three definitions because I invite you to think about them as I go through my brief presentation about who I am and share a piece of my story with you all today. I like to talk about hope in a racialized society for school social workers by beginning with talking about me. This is an image of me as a young baby. When we as babies are born, so much is already decided for us because we are babies. We can't decide for ourselves yet. Hope begins with our kiddos as young as infants, especially our young babies of color, our young kiddos of color. We live in a racialized society, and with that comes beliefs, values, assumptions, a society that tells us who we are or aren't because it is racialized, because of our skin color, because of our background, because of our native tongue, and because of our cultural practices. Hope in a racialized society is different for every one of us. How do we provide hope in a racialized society so babies like me in this picture are able to live healthy lives, maintain sustaining careers, and contribute to their communities? So I like to circle back, or oh, excuse me, I'm ahead of myself. I like to start and say that hope for me in a racialized society is connected to Chicago and Puerto Rico. I come from two proud Puerto Rican parents. My dad is from Chicago, raised in several of the Puerto Rican neighborhoods during his time there. My mom was raised in PR with my family and left PR as an adult and moved to Chicago. This is where my parents met and began their life. They raised their family as two uncollege educated adults in the Midwest. The journey my parents have embarked on embodies hope in a racialized society, a story very similar to many of the families I have served as a school social worker. I can talk all day about my amazing, beautiful parents, but I like to highlight a part of my dad's story today with you all. My dad barely has a high school education. My dad is second generation Puerto Rican. His parents, mis abuelos, did not speak English. That, amongst growing up poor and living within a system that does not set up our young boys of color up for success, contributed to his life trajectory. My dad became involved in the streets, gangs, and drugs, and he was doing things that were not helping him. His teachers disregarded him, and he never felt he had a safe person or a safe space or anyone advocating for him. I think about a lot, who were his teachers? Did any of his social workers try to help him? School counselors, school psychologists? Did he have safe places? Would it have helped my dad if educators looked like him? It's a miracle he's here today, given the choices he made as a kid and the adversity he faced. I reflect a lot about my parents and how they instilled so much hope in my sisters and I. They worked so hard and endured so much so that my sisters and I would have a better life and not struggle the way they did. Their words they constantly used to us. It wasn't until I graduated high school that I truly began understanding the meaning of all of this. I was the first in my family to attend college and graduate with not only a bachelor's degree, but a master's degree. This was huge for my family. Not only was I the first child of theirs, but I wasn't the last. I'm proud to state that my sisters and I, all of us are first generation college students. And my sisters are first generation college students with careers in wildlife and engineering respectively. My family's story is complex. In a society like ours that tells us who we are as Latinos, I know firsthand how blessed I am. Not a lot of people in my family have been as fortunate due to systematic issues like racism, classism, and other forms of oppression. So I'd like to circle back and introduce myself. Again, my name is Ronnie Rivera. My pronouns are he, him, his, él, but I'm comfortable with all pronouns as long as we are respectful. I have been a school social worker since 2016. I have recently transitioned to a new role here in MPS a month ago as the LGBTQ plus coordinator in the district. I work within the very new Department of Gender, Identity, and Inclusion here in Central Office, where we're working to support girls of color and LGBTQ plus students across the district. Outside of MPS, I work at Courage House MKE. Courage is the first and only group home in the state of Wisconsin that is a group home for LGBTQ plus youth. Lastly, about myself, I work at Brady East STD as an HIV counselor. I volunteer there and I help with reduction counseling and preventative education at a clinic that serves men who have sex with men. So I've talked about my background because the topic of this conference is hope in a racialized society, radical hope in a racialized society. I am a Puerto Rican, Boricua, Taino social worker. I am just one member of a racial ethnic group alongside many other racial and ethnic minority folk in today's society. However, this is just one part of me. We as people, we are so multifaceted. And a lot of our being and who we are has been formed due to the people and our ancestors who came before us. For me, hope in a racialized society includes my queerness, includes my gayness, includes the intersection of my brownness and my LGBTQ plus magic that I have to offer to this world. And so let me get my notes, y'all, so I don't forget what to say. As school social workers, we have a duty to think about all of our identities, all of the identities of our students and all of the identities of our families. I believe this is crucial to creating and maintaining hope in a racialized society. Because we say racialized, we're talking not only of our students of color, but our queer students of color, our religious students of color, our undocumented students of color, our students of color with diverse ability statuses. The list goes on and on because so many of our students and our families are multifaceted. So continuing and talking about the LGBT lens with using that lens within hope in a racialized society, I like to take the next couple of slides, just show some YRBS data regarding our LGBTQ plus students and MPS. And so here in MPS, we took the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey in 2019. MPS takes it every couple of years. We just took it. So hopefully we'll have updated data soon. But this is a good data point that we use in MPS to get a temperature check and a pulse of the risky behaviors our students are engaging with and their identities and how they intersect, and a bunch of awesome, important data points. I like to show some data points regarding LGBT students in comparison to our non-LGBT students. You can see in the yellow that there's differences as it relates to safety compared to non-LGBT students. For example, 26% of LGBT students who took the survey got into a physical fight on school property compared to 19% of non-LGBT students. As we talk about mental health concerns, this is huge. I like to highlight attempting suicide right there at the bottom. 26% of our LGBT students who took the survey attempted suicide compared to 8% of our non-LGBT students. We know that our LGBTQ plus students have higher rates of suicidality, mental health issues, and a variety of other issues and needs compared to their non-LGBTQ plus students. Substance use is another data point that I like to highlight. Using marijuana, 37% of our LGBTQ plus students are using compared to the 22% of our non-LGBT counterparts. So a lot of these data points that I've just gone through right here, sometimes they're twice, almost 3 times the amount of their non-LGBTQ plus students. So when we talk about hope in a racialized society, as school social workers, who are we including in that discourse? Who has a seat at the table? Who as school social workers are we providing that hope for? For me, as I showed in the past few slides, I need to include all of my students, especially my LGBTQ plus students of color in Milwaukee Public Schools. They deserve hope in today's racialized and often divided society. The day today, y'all, I will not be, I will be the first to admit that I struggle, very much so. This work is not easy. As stated earlier, we are working within a system that is operating as it is intended, a system at times that can be oppressive and can create numerous barriers. For example, literally yesterday was a day, the type of day where you come home and cry, and the type of day where you want to order a large pizza and eat ice cream and you don't want to see nobody. So shout out to my boyfriend who left me a cute little warm and fuzzy note attached to a bag that had goldfish in it. I could stand up here and talk about self-care or prioritizing your mental health or mindfulness. All of those things are important, but I'm not here to dive into them right now. I will say that our kiddos need us, and whether you are able to contribute equitable, accessible, and empowering services for our students for 1 year or 20 years or 30 years, you are contributing to hope in a racialized society. And so, in summary, my little spiel of introducing myself today, I leave you all with these images of Mirabel, the protagonist from Disney's animated movie Encanto. Mirabel has so much hope for her family and her casita. She had hope when those around her have none or struggle to maintain hope. She radiates hope because she believes. So I leave you all with be like Mirabel and take it day by day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. That the movie, I just got done seeing it with our 4-year-old granddaughter. It's a great one. I'm really glad that you gave it. It's really very impressive for
I love it.
particularly when you go into it with a Disney background. So it's like, wow. So thank you very much. Next, I'd like to introduce Jackie Thao. Jackie is the school social worker in the Whitnall School District, where she's housed at one elementary building, but support both of the elementary schools in various capacities. Her role consists of individual student meetings, case management, initial special education evaluations, and reevaluations. And reevaluations that are looking to change or add to a disability. She responds to crises, running small groups, lunch bunches, home visits, participating and implementing in PBIS and Tier 2 interventions, and leading the annual initiative called Book of the Month to incorporate more stories with BIPOC characters while reinforcing PBIS expectations. Jackie.
Thank you, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start off by thanking Jenny and Hannah and Angela, as well as the School of Social Work, for allowing me to be part of this panel amongst wonderful colleagues here on the screen that are going to be presenting or have been or just presented. Ronnie, you did a fantastic job. I don't know how I can follow. So just a little bit of background on myself. This is my 5th year of being a school social worker at Whitnall. I'm originally from Wausau, Wisconsin, so up north, right in the middle of the state, and lived there my whole entire life. I am of Hmong descent. My parents were refugees from Laos during the Vietnam War, and they've kind of lived up, in various states, and they settled in Wausau, and that's where I've been ever since then. And, throughout my whole life, I think I've always struggled with my own identity of, trying to assimilate in the American culture while also staying true to my Hmongness. And so I think through my experiences in Wausau, where a lot of our communities of color are Hmong, and now that we are becoming more diverse as the years have gone on, where more families are moving into the small city, and my experiences at Madison have been helpful in shaping me into who I am today and being more appreciative of my dual identity. And now as a school social worker, it's definitely played a role in how I navigate my role into implementing more inclusive practices and being a social worker in a racialized society. And so with some of my viewpoints in regards to maintaining hope in a racialized society, I think it's hard. I will speak from a perspective of working in a district that is small. It is in the Hales Corners, Greenfield area, right outside of Milwaukee. And, some people would say, well, you're outside of a super diverse big city. I'm sure that your district is very, well-versed in diversity and equity and all those things. But as many of you know, that is not the case, even though Greenfield and Hales Corners is right next door to Milwaukee. And so one way that I've maintained hope in, a district that's predominantly white is honestly being very vocal about ensuring that we're representing our students of color in our buildings, and ensuring that we are acknowledging their identities and showing to them, hey, just because you live or go to school in a predominantly white school, that doesn't mean your identity doesn't matter. And so a couple of years ago, when I first started, a couple of teachers came to me, and this was my 2nd year in the school, and I was still getting to know the staff. They were still getting to know me. I was one of 3 staff of color in the entire district. There's 4 schools, and then we obviously service our private schools. And 2 of our teachers had kind of noticed that their students were making a lot of racial remarks towards some of our students, and they really wanted to do something about it. So as many of you might be aware of in your own schools or in your own practicums, the interventions of PBIS, and how there are 3 core rules that they and values they follow, and expectations are be safe, respectful, and responsible. So these teachers came to me and said, we've really focused on being safe and responsible in our schools, but we are seeing less of that expectation of being respectful being followed by our students. So what can we do to introduce that conversation to our young students? I'm in the elementary schools, and how do we introduce that conversation to them without necessarily diving into too deeply into equity and representation yet, but that is the route that we want to eventually go on in our journey. And so we decided to come up with the idea of a book of the month, which is basically to introduce more children's books with representation of BIPOC, LGBTQ plus IA, different families, because we do have a lot of families who have two moms, two dads, single moms, single dads, and single parents, and just being raised by grandparents and so forth. So we wanted to first introduce that kind of language within our school, because we recognize that our students were not seeing much of it, and therefore making really inappropriate comments towards their classmates and being disrespectful in many regards. So we came together as a group. We went to our administration in my building, and it's been 3-4 years now since we've started that. And every month we go into the classrooms and read these different children's books, but focus more on the themes. And the books that we choose are very intentional. So in that sense, that has given me a lot of hope. While there, like Ronnie had said, there are a lot of frustrations. I would love to have more conversations about equity. In my role, however, and being in a smaller district that's predominantly white, it is harder. And I think there are frustrations across the buildings and among staff of, we're not doing enough for our students. So in some way that is hopeful. We have staff members who really want to bring those conversations across the board and teach those in our classrooms and make it more natural and make it less taboo. And then there are staff that don't, but then it's our jobs as educators to help them understand where we're coming from and to ultimately service our students in the best way possible so that they feel seen and are heard. So that's one way that we have truly created hope in the Whitnall School District, especially at the elementary level. And as we move forward, I hope to have more conversations on equity, and so that we can start implementing more of those social a small district that is predominantly white, and just, working together with my fellow colleagues who have the same values as I do, and, standing up for our students and advocating on their behalfs, and speaking with administration to see how we can get all of that started in our entire district. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Appreciate it very much. Our next speaker we will move on to then is Damaris Drohin de Arrieta. She will pronounce her name much better than me. She is the bilingual school social worker for the Office of Youth Re-Engagement at the Madison Metropolitan School District. Damaris is a resource to school and systems for systems of basic needs equity work. I should start over. She's a resource to school and systems basic needs equity work, recognizing social inequities affecting student access to education and relationships in school. She currently provides specialized social emotional support to opportunity youth using Dr. Robert N. Wright's model of forgiveness, supporting crisis prevention at the school level. After leaving Puerto Rico, Damaris has been serving Madison, Wisconsin since 1983. She is an alumna of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, achieving a Bachelor of Arts in Behavioral Science and Law, a certificate in criminal justice, a master's in social work with an emphasis in Title 40 child welfare, and a certificate in grief counseling. Thanks. Damaris?
Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Jenny and Angela and Hannah, for inviting me to do this presentation. It's really exciting. The topic of today is hope in a racialized society, and I decided to talk about how to resolve anger and restore hope through forgiveness. I am the bilingual school social worker with the Office of Youth Re-Engagement. I say my name, Damaris Drohin de Arrieta, and yes, I am Puerto Rican. I've lived in Wisconsin since 1983, and it feels like forever since I've been home. And I found that the topic of hope was very fitting to uh, what's happening around the world right now, and especially here on this mainland, because Puerto Rico was truly hit with a devastating couple of hurricanes only in 2017, and it caused a ripple effect of bringing more of a migration to the mainland and to other countries, including Europe, which was very interesting for me to learn. Um, but also because my experience in the United States, living here in Wisconsin, and very specifically here in Madison, has been to pretty much be the only Puerto Rican in any of the spaces where I have worked. And after this devastation on the island of Puerto Rico, I found that that was no longer true, that there were spaces where I could go in and find other professionals, teaching staff that came from Puerto Rico, and were talking about what happened to them there. And of course, what happened to them happened to my family too, because my family's still on the island. So let's start with hope, because hope is that piece that brings us together today. I looked at some definitions because I've always known that hope is not the same thing as just wishful thinking. A wish is more about expressing or feeling a very strong desire for something that's not going to be easily attained. It's wanting something that we can probably not see happen. But hope is different. Hope is often used interchangeably with wishing, and yet it's not, because it's about desiring something with the expectation of obtaining it. And it's in that fulfillment that we focus today, because there is so much for us to celebrate, and our resilience truly hinges on having that hope. When I think about the work that I'm doing, I first have to think about who I am. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. I was one of 7 siblings who was born there, and half of my siblings were born on the island, and the other half of us was born in New York, because my parents were traveling back and forth trying to make a living. And so I very much grew up in Puerto Rico. I don't really know New York. But I talk about that because it's part of our experience as a people. When I think about who I am, I'm part of that diaspora, but I'm also part of a Taino people. And I experienced the denial of my very existence while I was growing up. So I very specifically remember sitting in a classroom when I was in the 7th grade and having a teacher say all Indians were destroyed and no longer exist. And I'm sitting there thinking, I know my grandmother, I know my dad, I know my family, I know who I am, and I am very much an Indian person sitting in this classroom being told that I'm not. And it's very hard to find a voice when things like that happened. So the students that I'm working with now are students that we refer to as opportunity youth. And we're talking about these students, addressing the needs of these students. Opportunity youth is the students that are between their late teen years and their very early 20s, who have still the opportunity to grow and learn ways of doing things in better ways, right? In different ways, so that they can succeed. And so we're focusing on these youth because we know that we are able to bring responsive strategies and programs that will help them access quality education. So all is not lost. So even if there were things that were happening in their earlier years, we can still focus attention on the goals that they may either have had already or can create during those interactions. And we know that there's a lot of work to be done. And we need the continued partnership with community stakeholders. So my office, I'll call for short OIR, is truly focusing on defying those deficit-based notions that are reflected in our personal biases, which we all have. Like that, we don't even need to go into whether or not we have them. Everybody has them, but we really have to um, find ways of disrupting ingrained approaches and strategies that don't engage our youth, that don't promote growth, so that they can actually have a chance. And so, looking at dismantling structures, policies, procedures, so that our students can do better. And I go back to Puerto Rico because a slogan that's very political came up after Hurricane Maria. Puerto Rico se levanta, Puerto Rico rises, and it's a slogan that focuses on how, despite the widespread trauma that many of us suffered, either because our families are still there, as is the case with me because I live here but my family doesn't, or those who were there and were displaced, we now have an influx of students that are coming to our schools that need a special attention. And having an understanding of how we have drawn on our religious, cultural, and artistic resources to cope with this new reality is very important. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit emotional when I have this conversation. So it's very important to think about all of the ways in which we can address the needs of the students that are arriving here. But that's not to say that the historical racial trauma that already existed here is going to be ignored, right? Because we have historically seen um, um, issues that have to do with white supremacy. And it's hard to have these conversations because there's a lot of systemic racism and violence that has been born out of hatred. And so when we think about the formerly enslaved people and how hard it was for the right to vote to come to happen, right? And the white response to that, which included Jim Crow segregation and voter suppression and oppression through law enforcement. And we want to address that because there's a lot of that is still happening. And so the Institute of Forgiveness at the University of Wisconsin in Madison has been that place that has helped me find a way of addressing equity in education from a racially responsive lens and a culturally responsive lens. So forgiveness has been looked at as something very soft and very mushy when it's actually very hard. And we find a lot of people that will say, I'm not a forgiving person. And we see it in our young. And that's worrisome because at a very young age, people are already saying, I don't even want to hear about it. And it's truly a tragedy not to talk about what forgiveness is because it's not a dismissal of wrongdoing. Actually, it very much focuses on the truth that there was an injustice, that there was something that happened that was very painful, very hurtful, and that it needs to be addressed. And forgiving just allows some room for that weakness, for that error to have happened, so that we can stop feeling resentment and we can take the anger that comes as a result of that injustice and make it smaller so that we can address things with a more settled heart. And that's the beauty of what forgiveness brings to us. And scientifically, it's been shown to reduce psychological depression, to reduce anxiety, a decrease in PTSD. It improves the quality of life. It helps us focus more clearly. It truly can be a lifesaver. And so when I think about how hope comes into play here, I have to think about the finding meaning in those things that we have endured that will lead us to hope. Because there is no one rule book that exists that tells us how we are able to find meaning in our suffering. We have to figure out how to discuss with our young without denying the grief, the anger, the disappointments that they have experienced, that there is a better way, a different way, a way that's compassionate towards ourselves and others, so that we can look at those experiences that are very difficult and say, not settle for saying we'll just have to make the best of it, and not sugarcoating or trying to hide under the rug that there was something unfair that happened, some injustice that happened. Instead, we're going to say, we're going to ponder what we have learned from going through these experiences and how we can make something good out of this difficult thing that happened. Because maybe in that process, we can learn how to be more tolerant of the imperfections of others. And we all want that, right? And so when I think about racial justice and hope, for me it means that celebration of Columbus Day, and consider that as a Puerto Rican and as a Taína with knowledge of that ancestry, it's been painful that it's still a celebrated day. Not because it doesn't have meaning for somebody else. I know that for the Italians, it's been a celebration that lifts up some of the deficits in their own culture at that time, and they were able to bring that to the table. So I'm not dismissing that. But for my people, it meant the pillaging, the raping, the genocide of people that were already here, and that is not something to be celebrated. And then I think about my intersectionality with within the African diaspora, because I very much also claim my blackness. And there's been a cry for racial justice for some 400 plus years in the making that moves us. And so we cannot ignore that. And so when I'm looking at all of this and I'm working with students, and I mostly work with students that are in the detention center, I'm bringing to them an idea of looking at all of the things that have made them hurt and choosing one. And I asked of them to please not choose the biggest one, to actually focus on something that's smaller, something that they can sit with for several days at a time, and consider the humanity of maybe that sibling or cousin or parent that made them feel a certain kind of way. Because again, we're not talking about the biggest worst thing that happened to them, but about that smaller thing that's irritating or hurting them, and figure out if they can look at the other side, and can they get rid of the resentment that has come with that act that may not have been so big after all. And can they then offer goodness in the way of mercy to that other person if they still want to stay in relationship with that person, right? And we're not talking about reconciliation. There's a lot of accountability that has to go around. But when we forgive, we're not asking for something, we're just showing mercy. And familiarizing our children with mercy can go such a long way. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Damaris, very much. Our last speaker, final panelist today, is Jerome Flowers. Jerome Flowers serves as a Dean of Students for the Madison Metropolitan School District. Jerome has been serving in this capacity for the last 5 years at both the high school and middle school level. In addition, he's entering his final semester of the Master of Social Work program here at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work. So, Jerome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Like my colleagues before, I want to thank everyone for being here. My colleagues before did an amazing job of going through different aspects of what hope means. We have, the backgrounds, history, definitions, which is always good. And you all don't know this, but beforehand, I was trying to figure out how can I engage with you all. My colleagues know I was trying to figure out different ways to engage with you all. And since our platforms don't allow, what I'm gonna ask everyone to do now is take a minute or two and think back over your personal journeys of your hope givers. People who came alongside you, and ever since you met them, there were seeds planted and you begin to walk a new path. So I'll give everyone a minute, and then to just think about that, to reflect, and then I'll share mine. So for myself, the two names that came to mind is Mr. Ceno. So in middle school, I saw things a little differently. Was mixing it up. And so one of my counselors at Georgia O'Keeffe Middle School here in Madison hooked me up with the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. In walks Mr. Ceno. Doesn't know me from anything. I don't know him as well. But one thing that'll always stand with me is he gave me opportunity. And what I mean by he gave me opportunity is he didn't let my past influence our interactions. That right there gave me hope that people could do that. And the mistakes that I made won't have to follow me everywhere I go. And so he was a hope giver to me, and we still keep in touch this day. And it was because he gave that hope that I have now been a big brother for 15 years, and I am on my second little. My first little was 20 and working really hard here in Madison. And now I have another little who is 9 years old. The second person that comes to my mind, and then I'll talk about some characteristics of this particular person. She's a social worker. Her name is Miss Michelle Olson, social worker at La Folla High School. I got to work with her for the last 8 years. But some qualities that she had that planted those seeds of hope is that she always greeted me with a smile. She always listened and sought to understand. She showed up consistently, and she believed in me. And as we think back, and we're not able to share, so I get that, but those are some of the similar things for those hope givers in your life. I know Ronnie talked a lot about parents, and those are hope givers as well. And you can see it through the photos and the pictures and what lived through and how they've helped and shaped on the journey. So I just wanted to take a moment to put that in the room. So another thing when I think about hope, and this is just from my own personal perspective, as for me, how do I maintain hope? It starts with my faith, my purpose. I truly believe I'm walking God's plan for my life. And the reason I say this is because back when I was an undergrad at UW-Madison, right after I declared social work major, there's a portfolio or some project you do in undergrad where you have to figure out your family tree. And in doing so, we were able to trace our lineage back to Virginia. And as I was walking through the notes and gathering all the things that my family had and having those conversations. Through the lineage, there was preachers, teachers, community activists, and social workers. Fast forward another year. My mom's mother passed. And at her obituary, I was reading through. She was a school social worker in the Chicago public schools. Had no idea, just because she was my grandmother and my elder, so I didn't know what she did in her professional life because she was retired, but knew she had a lot of wisdom. So when I read that, I was like, huh. You know, thinking of that about being something bigger, the purpose being bigger than myself. So then I'll even bring it a little closer to home. In 2009, when I graduated from UW-Madison, my older brother graduated in 2009 from UW-Madison with his master's in social work. And then I had a younger brother graduate in 2009 with a degree in social work, as well as myself. We never talked about it. We never talked about majors because we were first generation. So we had no idea majors. And I had another brother that go to school in Minnesota. And he also got his undergraduate degree in social work. We never talked about it, but somehow we all found out that seemed like home to us and serving and being with one another. Another part of my faith that gives me hope is that throughout my journey, no hardships that I've faced, pain that I went through has been wasted. The things that I've gone through in my journey as I begin to pour back into people have seemed to be perfectly placed when I'm interacting with others who are going through similar situations, and I'm able to show up in my real authentic self and to have sympathy and empathy and compassion. And sometimes that's all people need to drown out the doubt, is someone to sit and listen and be in the trenches. No two situations are alike and no two responses are alike, but just being there and being able to empathize and be in the muck and the mud, because you've been through mucky and muddy times. And you know what that sense of loneliness feels. You know what those questions that get louder and louder, those self-doubt questions that get louder and louder, and you need somebody to help to quiet those. Probably my favorite thing that keeps me hopeful about my faith is that anyone can be great. You don't have to know everything. I don't have to be Einstein. I don't have to be LeBron. I don't have to be, you know, the smartest thinker, but just a compassion to serve. And that, you know, through my faith I learned, and through the Bible, there's, you know, a lot of different people. You know, when I think about Nehemiah, the cupbearer, fishermen that God was able to use, Abraham and Sarah, who most people thought were too old. So that's part of it for me. The other portion, when I'm going through my perspective, that keeps me hopeful in these trying times, is being intentional. Oftentimes what we hear, especially in the work we do, because it's hard work, is we hear the bad and the ugly. So we have to be very intentional about going to try to find the good and making sure that we breathe that in as well. Because things are hard. You know, progress is not as fast as we would like it to be. So going to search and making sure you find those articles, or you find that media that's uplifting, and making sure you add that to your daily intake. Another thing that keeps me hopeful is celebrating the wins of myself, of people in the community, of people all over, as much as acknowledging the losses. You know, sometimes in this work, we can focus too much on when things don't go right. And that shifts the focus for those times when things are going right and things are moving and things are happening, and you're seeing the youth make those connections, and they're coming back after graduating high school and talking to you and sharing the good news and things of that nature. And another tool that helps me is being intentional about being honest with myself, and always having those hard questions with myself about my intentions, about my actions, and having those reflections. So that keeps me hopeful, because in that I can see my progress as a human being. By seeing my progress as a human being, that helps me to think about others' progress and keep that at the center, and always seek to understand and to seek to keep those seeds going and growing. And so those are just some of the things that I think about when we think about keeping hope, when we think about maintaining that work. And yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jerome. And thank you to all of our speakers. It's interesting because nobody knew what each other was going to say beforehand. And yet it's something where I'm hearing a lot of themes and a lot of things of being authentic and showing up and being there with students. And that was also something that the keynote speaker brought up a lot earlier also. We have some time now that we will go to some questions, and it can be whoever would like to answer at the time for the question. One that had come up is the fact of looking at this current school year and what a rough transition that's been for many of the students, that we're really in the midst of a mental health crisis with so many students in schools, and how they're showing up differently in various spaces. For example, that students were used to being able to say things in chat or more anonymously when everything was online. It was a lot different than now. They're saying cruel and mean things face to face. And what approaches are you trying to help address these issues in your schools? So any one of you who might like that.
I can go. That's a great question. I think about that a lot. Our kids are kids, and they were expected to be home, virtual learning, sometimes alone without parents, sometimes taking care of younger siblings. And they're expected to do that for about 1.5 years, 2 years. I think about, I was in a high school last semester, and our freshmen, the last time they were in school in person was 7th grade, right? One moment they're middle schoolers, and then the next they're in high school. And so for me last semester, and still currently, one thing that we were working to do was to create joy and create space for our kiddos to just be kids, because they didn't get to connect with other kids. They didn't get to foster community with other kids. They didn't get those social emotional learning pieces, those, when we think about protective factors or those preventative measures to help with their mental wellness. We at the high school that I support, we are implementing a GSA. We have a GSA, a Gender Sexuality Alliance, formerly known as Gay Straight Alliances. And we had over 100+ kiddos sign up for this club. And that's really amazing that so many kiddos are interested. But I know for a fact, a lot of kids just want opportunities to just foster connection. And we were the only one of the clubs at the time at that school. There's like, we're expecting our students to wake up early and be in class, be there all day. Then they have to wear a mask, and maybe they're not allowed opportunities to transition or go to the bathroom. It's very hard. I can't even do this as an adult. Shoot, but you want our kids to do this? Mm-mm. And so I'm thinking a lot, like mental wellness is there. It's not cookie cutter, but I know my long story short answer is creating space for our kiddos to just be kids.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to address that question? Or we have lots of other questions too, but if you have something you'd like to say for that. Thanks. We have a question that's specifically looking at the book of the month thing. So I think Jackie, that we addressed it to you, and then others can answer also. But both looking at do you have criteria that you use to select the books and guidelines for leading discussions? And then also the idea of that you mentioned you work at the elementary level through reading more inclusive and equitable books in the classes. Are there things that your middle schools are doing around the same goal of teaching white students about their peers of color? So, just in general, how is that working as far as the book of the month, and how are you doing it with your students?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So we don't necessarily have a specific criteria. Right now, it is mainly the school counselor and I reading through and the children's books. And so every month, we focus on a character trait, and we tie it to our PBS expectations. So for February right now, our theme is going to be on kindness. And so we've chosen the book like BU. And so we basically create lessons out of the books that we read, and then we teach those in the classroom. So there aren't necessarily specific guidelines or criteria, but it is just us being more intentional in reading past the small paragraph that they provide on websites or on the internet, and just being intentional in that way. And I will have to mention, I probably forgot to mention this before, we are really trying to push for more books that include conversations about Black Lives Matter and other areas of intersectionality and representation. And so we're really pushing for that right now. Hopefully we will get to that point. Let's see, I hope I answered your questions. As for the middle school, I can't speak for the middle school. And I don't believe they are doing anything there, but I know they have social emotional lessons. So we have a social emotional curriculum called Lions Quest that we implement at the middle school and across the grade levels. So that is something that we've taught through there. And there are conversations about bullying, conflict, how we treat others, others that are different from us. So I know at the middle school and high school, they have more topics that dive deeper into those areas compared to the elementary. And elementary, we just kind of supplement through that. So I hope I answered those questions.
Can I add
Well, and
something to that,
always, I
Jenny?
think, yes, certainly, yes.
In
I was just
regards
going to say
to,
also that all of you in the school districts, people can also try to email you in your various school districts. So yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ronnie.
no problem. Sorry for interrupting. And to kind of add on what Jackie was saying about more inclusive and equitable books, we're lucky that we're living in a time right now where we're seeing more representation in our books, more diverse stories in our literature. And I am a firm believer that a lot of our elementary books is books that we can be using at middle school level, at a high school level, at the university level, working with adults, the folks who don't go to university. Even the high school, I'm constantly using books that are elementary books that were geared for elementary children. If a quick Google search will be helpful in looking for books with diverse stories and diverse characters. There's a new book recently, like Water Keepers, had to do with the environment and First Nation folk. There's a lot of books right now about our young girls of color and their hair and their curls and their kinky hair, and it's amazing. There's a lot of new books out right now as it relates to talking about what a baby is and how a baby is made through a gender neutral lens. Like, these are things that are out in the shelves right now. So I really encourage you all to look into that and do the research, because those books are out there and we can all benefit from it.
And even piggybacking onto Ronnie, I know some of our 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, when we choose books, some of them don't have a lot of text. It's a lot of picture book. And we've had conversations in the classroom about how, hey, even though this might not have a lot of words and you think this might be really childish, these books have really valuable lessons that we can learn from, even though there isn't much text when, the special guest reader of the day is coming into your classrooms to read it. So our older grade levels the teachers have done a really great job of helping our students understand and appreciate children's books, when in the classroom, they're so focused on reading chapter books. So that is, conversations that we've had to address maybe students rolling their eyes or not really understanding why we have books that seem younger to them.
Thank you. And I always feel the school librarians are a huge resource that I always would use when I was working in schools, because they know a lot of the latest stuff that's out there that often that we don't even realize. So absolutely. Couple other questions. One would be that it can be hard to have anti-racism conversations, especially if someone says something offensive. How do we move forward or push through these conversations while being clear to address the offensive comments and not let them go? And this would come up certainly with staff, with students, and with parents. Anyone would like to answer that in any manner?
I have a story to share of how I addressed it once, and it was through Book of the Month. So we had a sub paraprofessional come in for the day, and she was Chinese and she had an accent. And throughout the day, we realized the teachers and some music teacher came to us and said, hey, a lot of our students are making fun of her and teasing and laughing at her. And I can see the whispers, and I addressed it in my classroom, but I would love it if one of you went into the actual classroom and spoke with these students. And coincidentally, I was going in there to read the book, The Invisible Boy, and it's about a little boy who was different. He ate different food and kids would ignore him, and he just seemed very invisible. And I used that book to kind of tie into how the students had treated that paraprofessional that day. And I also used the example of their teacher who was very new. And I said, how would you feel if you were a new student or a new adult coming into school for the day, and you were there to help out of the kindness of your heart because, the teacher wasn't there, and then you see that students were making fun of you? Do you think you would return? And the students were able to understand that, and they're like, no, I wouldn't return. And so I addressed the problem, and I said, I heard today that all of you were being disrespectful and unkind to one of the adults in the building who is here to help us. And I gave the examples of what I had heard from the music teacher. And I said, do you think she would want to come back and help you guys in the classroom? Do you think she would feel comfortable? Do you think she would feel safe walking into the building, knowing that there's potential that kids would be making fun of her? And so I was able to address the lesson of the day, but also address the situation that had happened during that music class that the teacher had brought to our attention. So in some ways, using stories is really helpful for our kids to understand their actions, and to help them realize they need to be responsible for what they do, and really think before they act, and recognize that their actions can really be negatively impactful to someone else.
Great example. Thank you.
I can also answer that. When approaching those difficult conversations, the first thing I do is I think about the relationship that me and that other person has, and then I read the room. So those two things are what I do first, and then after thinking about those things, that will influence how I respond. And in those moments where you don't really have a relationship with the other person, I would always err on the side of going to that person quietly at a different time, and trying to talk through it with that person outside of the group.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
I would add to all of this that the age of the student will matter greatly. There's a big difference between working with a third grader and a 10th grader, for example. And I've been working with a lot of students at the high school level, and it's been my experience that if there's some kind of a relationship with the student beforehand, it's a lot easier to have these conversations, even though they're difficult. When there's not that relationship, but we catch it, it's still very important to address it. And so how we do it depends on what kind of it's so situational, right? Because if the student is just being offhanded, maybe having that quiet conversation with another adult in the building, maybe I don't know, maybe an AP or someone else, like a counselor, or like being the trusty social worker doesn't always mean that we're the right person. I dropped my book. Sorry. That we're the right person to have that conversation. Maybe there's someone that already has that relationship with the student and can have a better engagement with them. But if that's not the case, then we just really have to dive in and see where they're coming from and leaning in without being accusatory, right? Like just trying to figure out what they're thinking about and how they're thinking about it before we have that explanation of how their behavior is being harmful, and supporting them and making amends, because we all make mistakes and some mistakes are bigger than others, but they need to be addressed.
Forgot to unmute myself. Thank you. That leads a little bit into some of the another question that has come up that has to do with parents and looking at how to use an anti-racist framework in situations. The example that was given, it says, as school social workers, sometimes we have to hotline parents. How do you go about that with an anti-racist framework? I hotlined someone recently, and unfortunately the police showed up with the children's division worker, even though my report did not warrant that. So times when we have, other people are reacting and it doesn't fit an anti-racist framework, which makes it very hard all the way across the board. Anyone have any suggestions in that type of situation? Obviously, this is a tough question. But yes, Damaris?
It is. It's a very difficult question, and without knowing more about why the police would have been brought into the mix is also kind of concerning. But I think I would want to have that person that decided that that was an important step to be part of the conversation also. I don't know. Would need more information, really.
Well, I know in these, it's where you have other systems interacting that are outside our control. As school social workers, that happens multiple times, and so it's very, very hard when we think maybe we have we're trying to use an anti-racist framework, but then an administrator responds a different way, or a parent does, or the police do, or a human service. I mean, there's all those different interactions that can make it very hard, and we can so these conversations might need to occur later on also, and really looking at, once that happened, if it's like the, the police or the children's worker or whoever else is showing up, to have those conversations, to include them even if it's not at that moment, and building on some of that stuff you were saying there, Damaris.
Can I add something, Jenny?
Oh yes.
That's a hard question. I would agree with everything that was shared. I think something that I keep thinking about, the system isn't broken, it's operating as it intended. And as we think about us as social workers working within numerous systems, education, healthcare, the government, the police, all of these things, what is our role within that? And this is a simple answer, and I know it's more nuanced than that. What I think about is how can, as social workers, as school social workers, part of our goal and our duty is to advocate and elevate those voices that need to be elevated. And so how are we advocating when we know, for example, what was asked in the question, highlighting parents and using an anti-racist framework, but other systematic folks are getting involved, such as the police, and it's not going the way we want. How are we using our voices to create change on a systematic level? What needs to be done on that universal policy level that can trickle down and help benefit our kids? And so I talk a lot from my perspective, seeing what was happening as a school social worker, seeing the inequities and injustice that our trans and gender nonconforming kiddos were experiencing, and working really hard to get into this role where I'm working to help create policy change, but especially for our queer students of color, because MPS serves primarily students of color, but we don't, when we think about students of color, we also need to think about our queer students of color. And so what work in your school district needs to be done on the systematic level? Who are allies or people that can help create that change and help fight the fight with you?
Well, thank you. We have time for a few more questions, and I know certainly also if there's any one of the panelists that there's a particular question that's standing out that you really want to address, to be sure to feel free to do so also. One that had come up, if we're trying to look at it, that things are really tough right now for staff and overall, and for school social workers. And the question was, how do we have grace with ourselves and act with grace towards our students? And that grace not meaning in the particular religious word of grace, but in kindness to ourselves. What actions can we take to support some of the most vulnerable students in particular? Anyone want to address that?
Yeah, I can kind of go. I'm going to piggyback off what Ronnie talked about as an adult and going through the pandemic, you know, and sort of some of the things that our students are struggling with, you know, as they were coming back. And I say that to when we're thinking about grace, is that we're all learning. I saw a question earlier about adequate experience in the chat, and it's hard to ever feel adequately experienced as a social worker because things are always changing, they're always evolving. There's new tasks, there's new responsibilities, there's new learning. So it's really hard to ever feel, you know, adequately, that you have adequate experience. It's sort of like parenting. It's really hard, you know, there's many books, there's many things, but it's really hard to feel, you know, adequately that you are parent correctly, because as time goes on, there's new challenges, there's new things, and then you got to learn and adapt. And so having grace for yourself is similar. There's going to be times where you encounter things that you've never seen before. Our students and our families and just this world in general will give those tasks to us as social workers, and just being patient with yourself, because we won't have all the answers. But knowing that a good step would be to consult and lean on your team, because different people can help put the puzzle together and help be great thought partners to help you be solution focused, solution oriented, to come up with a game plan so you are able to respond in a way that continues to uplift that student and the community, in that particular student community as well.
Thanks. Anybody else have anything they wanted to add to that?
Yes. I would add to that. I work with a wonderful team at the Office of Youth Reengagement. We're a full team of 5, and it's amazing that we can lean on each other in ways that sometimes leave us in awe, because no one person has all the answers. But I would say that of all the things that we do as we're trying to act with grace towards ourselves and towards our students, so that we can support some of the most vulnerable students that we have, is to really check our personal bias. That's something that staff needs to be mindful of, and that we all have. And so we carry personal biases, and it's important to keep them at the door when coming into a building, because you know it's entirely possible, and it has made recent news, that there have been times when these biases have impacted the way in which we deliver services to our students, to the point that it has caused harm. So when we talk about carrying ourselves with grace, I would say that this is a very baseline preliminary step that we can take on a daily basis. That it's easy to make comments and take actions that manipulate the way we treat others, and that's not something we want to do. And then the other thing is that there are times when students struggle with behaviors or mental health issues, and with other things, I don't know. You name them, right? Because the list is amazingly long. And there are times when and it's unfortunate, but I have seen it, I have heard it, and I have learned from it that there are times when staff will make attributions about students and their families. So having the courage to lean in with curiosity and ask questions of the staff making those attributions, and asking them, say more about that. How do you know that this is true? And in a very gentle but firm way, challenging those attributions, because oftentimes there's no basis for them, right? And they do harm. So that's another way of interrupting in a racially um, uh, competent way. I don't know. Like, yeah. Thank you.
And I would have to piggyback on that too, Damaris, is something as simple when we teach our staff about mental health and how we can support our students is being mindful of our facial expressions and our body language, and removing ourselves from the classrooms or around children if we are consulting with other staff members or with each other, because students are bright, they're so smart, and they can read body language and facial expressions. And if they recognize that you're walking into the door and they can feel whatever kind of feeling you're emoting and it's not a good one, they won't feel safe consulting with you. They won't feel comfortable talking with you about maybe what's going on at home or what's going on, or they're stressed out about the reading test that they're walking into. So something we've told our staff is something as minor as that is so crucial in, showing grace to our students and supporting them in such a huge way that we might not even realize.
Absolutely. Well, I know that this year, particularly the last couple of years in schools, that the role of the school social worker in taking care of the staff has been really increased, because staff has had such tension, such difficulties, pressures all the way around it, and pressures from our communities. And we've talked a little bit about that, but are there any other ideas about how to support staff when we see them being so overly stressed and not dealing with things in a good manner? You started, with some of those ideas, Jackie, but any others that people would like to add on to for that, and better ways to support them?
One strategy is, is just to ask, is there anything I can share off your plate that, I can help you with? Because sometimes it's really a task thing. It's a lot of things need to get done in a short amount of period of time. And that anxiety is really coming from just a pure task responsibility. So sometimes it's just asking, how can I share? Another time it could be, sending a quick email, just thinking of you, no, today was a rough day. That, or oftentimes I use humor. So it's sending a funny text message with the song that we're not gonna take it. Just joking around, things of that nature. So just to bring a smile. So those are some of the strategies that I utilize in supporting colleagues in this work.
I would say, oh, you go, Ronnie. I'll let you. Oh. I would say along with that, one thing, I think I can speak to my building. They're so used to me and the school counselor showing gratitude. I think she and I are very intentional every year of doing something for staff. And this year we know that everyone is experiencing a collective trauma of the pandemic, and everything's hard and stressful, and teachers are still being expected to push through curriculum and be rigorous and so forth. So there's a lot of pressure on their part. And one thing we try to do is really make our administration in the building recognize that maybe staff is going through a really hard time. So really encouraging that empathy component of, while you may want them to implement XYZ, be mindful that they're going through some things too. And using that trauma-informed lens, we always say use it for the kids, but we also have to recognize being that we need to be trauma sensitive to our staff. And I think that can really change the trajectory and morale of a building if you acknowledge that everyone is going through a hard time, and just being kind and empathetic towards those you work with, and letting your administration know too, because sometimes they're so busy they might not even realize what staff is going on through.
I do want to add that, we as a panel have been sharing strategies and ideas on how to support others when morale is low, when wellness is low, when we're going through it. And I think it's also really important for us as social workers who are constantly receiving questions and input from staff, parents, students, administrators, like, hey, I'm kind of going through it. Can I lean on you? We ourselves need to take care of ourselves. I really believe that as someone who's on a healing journey, always on a healing journey, I really think that my own healing and filling my own cup will, when my cup overfills, it will pour over into the cups around me, or those around me will benefit from my own healing. And so I think there needs to be some balance between being there for others and also taking care of ourselves, because if not, I mean, we're all in this field for service and servitude, and we can't always put everyone's needs before our own.
Well, and that's always a hard question, I think, for social workers overall. How do we do that? And particularly in a time when it's extra stressful. And people that I've talked with who've been school social workers for 20 plus years, they're like, this year has been the hardest that they've had to face, just for the students, for the staff, and overall. So yes, definitely the best that we can do that for ourselves. And to realize that each of us have our own path, like you were saying, Ronnie. There's various ways to do this. And we have to figure that out for our own selves as what works, but then also in supporting each other and learning from each other. Well, as I'm looking at the time, I realize I have just a couple closing statements to make, and I wanted to thank everyone on the panel so very much for sharing your personal experiences, your opinions, your ideas and suggestions, and in this challenging topic, I think, as far as how to keep hope. That is not a simple answer. It's not a simple thing to do. So I appreciate all of that. I also want to thank to our behind-the-scenes tech person, Hannah Klusendorf, because without Hannah, we would not be able to be doing this and making it all work and be all recorded. I know a couple people, I had sent out a link earlier on for the evaluation form that somehow either I mistyped or it's not working. So don't worry about that, because everyone will be receiving an email that would be evaluation for today, and then another one if you're able to be there at at the follow-up part of the conference next Friday. So a reminder about that, and watch for an email for that. And thank everyone for attending today for the conference. Wanting to remind you that if you want to attend next Friday's session, you have to also register for that day. I put the link out at the beginning, but also going back to our conference website, because it's a separate registration even though it's free. And a reminder again that those of you who have requested CEUs, when you register, they will also be coming to you in an email. So hopefully that we'll see many of you next week for more dynamic content, helping us all really look at how to maintain radical hope in a racialized society. And again, a huge thank you to all of our panelists here today. I very much appreciate it, and look forward to working with you more in the future. Thank you all, and thanks for coming for our attendees.